Верочка, я хотела бы напомнить, что всем надо сесть. Коля, ты куда уходишь? Если вы думаете, что выпускники — это посещение факультативное, то вы ошибаетесь.
So if you think that you don't have to observe, if you don't have to observe the timetable, so that's you're wrong, because even if they are graduates, you still have to make time to come on time, because we keep records of everyone who's late, who is not coming on time. And it's all just reflected, it's put all in the minutes, so that's why you have to be on time. I would like to apologize, so please. So sit down, just find seats, please. So where is your seat? Yeah, sit down where you stand, just find the closest seat. So I'd like to apologize that we are breaking the course of our history of our seminar, and Irina Prokhorova is one of our best experts, and so we can only compliment her, and so I would like just to compliment her just on her just great job. And so she called in sick, and she has a sore throat, and it hurts her to speak, and I hope. So that's I would like to apologize to all of you, and I wish she would get well as soon as possible. And now I would like to so Kit Hepson just well you know him very well, so he will say the rest, and so we love all of us, we love him, so let's give him a round of applause. We all love him. So I'd like to give a huge thanks to him, because he's the decoration of our seminars, and so then Anglo-Saxon component so adds to it, and but to bring an MP as Richard Bacon, so it was quite a challenging task. It was so difficult, and so for a number of reasons, because today is the birthday of his little kid, that he's here, so let's applaud that. So let's congratulate him on the occasion. And the second part of the story was that Keith will tell you what he is doing in reality. I don't know what he is doing, so just I will listen to him what he is doing. And then thirdly, he is the person who is because Kit just was taking us on the rounds in the Parliament, British Parliament, so he showed us around, and somewhere in the lobby many years ago, he promised that he would come and visit us many years ago, so when he was an MP. And so his the most recent heroic achievement, that he is the only expert who so he agreed to speak instead of Mrs. Prokhorova, because he is always ready. So being a politician, he is always ready to come forward and fill in for others.
Well, let me say how very pleased I am to be back, Lena, despite the little sort of embarrassing praise that you heaped on me there. But it is a real pleasure, and particularly to see so many older faces at this alumni seminar. Now, I know I'm sometimes prone to longish introductions, so I have an admission, Lena, which is that I've now vowed not to speak in public for longer than I make love in private. So in conclusion...
No, it's in the reduction, not conclusion.
Anyway, so I don't think it translated directly into the subtleties into the Russian translation. However, I do need to give you some background on Richard Bacon. He was educated at the London School of Economics, and then he went into the city as an investment banker, and he went into journalism, financial journalism, and financial public relations. He then eventually got elected to Parliament in 2001 for a very nice part of the country, South Norfolk on the east side. It's a very, very attractive, nice area, where he gets about 50% of the entire electorate voting for him. He gets 50% of the poll, and our polls are not rigged in any way, so that is a very, in our system, very impressive figure. And he immediately got put on the Public Accounts Committee. Now, the Public Accounts Committee is a collection of selected members of Parliament from all parties, and it is, in my view, the most important of all the committees of Parliament, because it scrutinises how government spends everybody's money on whatever the programme, little, big, huge, billions, or what have you. Richard is an impassioned believer in more transparency of how government works, the competence of government, how well it does things, and above all, the value for the taxpayer for the money they put in. And he has been, I think, at least 4 times awarded. I think he's been even voted by his colleagues as Parliamentarian of the Year for his abilities, his efforts. Last year, in particular, the Spectator magazine, one of our leading political journals, again made him Parliamentarian of the Year, largely because he was one of a handful, a dozen or so members of Parliament, who voted against the government and the opposition when they wished to bring in a piece of legislation curtailing some of the freedoms of the press. He has that sort of reputation of standing out for things he believes are right. He was one of only half a dozen members of his own party to vote against the war in Iraq, and he voted against the potential war in Syria. So he has just this last year produced a book. It's called Conundrum. I'm sure you can all download it and buy it. And the title is Why Every Government Gets Things Wrong and What We Can Do About It. And that's what he's going to talk about today and give you his ideas on how we can really make a difference.
Keith, thank you.
Сказать, во-первых, еще раз.
And I would like just to thank Richard once again after this presentation, and I'd like to remind all of us that when you have 50% of electorate votes, and when and everything is not fraudulent, and all the elections are honest, it's more than 100%. And so that's it. It's practically unrealistic. 50% is a lot.
Thank you very much. May I say what a pleasure it is to be here and an honor. I came to the school 5 years ago in St. Petersburg, and I think the work which the school does is very important. I have been a member of Parliament for 13 years, since 2001. I'm a Conservative member of Parliament. I joined the Conservative Party in 1978 when I was a teenager, when there was still very much a Cold War going on. In fact, I joined the Tory party, the Conservative Party, for 2 reasons, really. I think the 2 people who influenced me most were Margaret Thatcher and Leonid Brezhnev. And so the Cold War was a big influence on me as a child. It was one of the reasons I got involved in politics. I was very concerned about it as a child. And one of the reasons I'm here today is because I was extremely impressed 5 years ago, and I wanted to come back. And also because I have decided I'm not going back to the Cold War. I'm just not going to go back to the Cold War. Now, I think it's probably true. By the way, I'm not an expert on international politics or international diplomacy. Most of my expertise is domestic. I studied at the London School of Economics for 5 years in total, and I did do some international politics, but I don't pretend to be an expert on international diplomacy at all. On the other hand, when I look at the last 20 years, and I look at the people who are experts on international politics and international diplomacy, it's perfectly obvious to me that the experts haven't done a very good job. So I have decided to contract my own foreign policy on the basis that I can't rely on anybody else to do it for me. So it's a great pleasure to be here. The committee that Keith referred to, which I sit on, the Public Accounts Committee, is very old. It goes back much further than any other committees. It goes back to the 19th century, to 1861. And its job is to look at value for money and the accounts for taxpayers' money. Much of our work in Parliament is done through committees, as is the case in many different committees in many different parliaments around the world. The role of committees is important in most parliaments. We have a very important ally on our committee, what we call the National Audit Office. I think in most constitutional systems there is a supreme audit institution of some kind. In France, it's the Cour des Comptes. In Spain, the Tribunal de Cuentas. In Germany, the Bundesrechnungshof. In Italy, the Corte dei Conti. In the United States, the GAO, or the General Accountability Office. And ours is called the NAO, the National Audit Office. And as the name Corte dei Conti suggests, most of these bodies, these supreme audit institutions, they are courts of account. They are counting houses. They make sure that government counts what it spends. And that's been the historic role that goes back in some cases into the Middle Ages. But our National Audit Office performs another role as well. It does perform the audit for all major public bodies, and it publishes the accounts and audits the accounts for all major public bodies. But it performs another function as well. There are 800 employees, roughly. 600 of them, roughly, do the audit work. 200 employees do value for money studies. They look at particular areas of government spending, not from the point of view of do the numbers add up in the accounting sense, but from a value for money perspective. They ask a different question. They ask not do the numbers add up, but they ask was the money wisely spent? Was it spent economically, effectively, and efficiently? The 3 E's in management jargon: economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. And we have similar arrangements in the various countries that make up the United Kingdom. There are similar arrangements for the Assembly in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, and they have their own audit offices as well. But the London-based audit office does by far the biggest amount of work and is best known internationally. I think it's fair to say that the different countries in the world that have this sort of system vary considerably in the extent to which the audit office does value for money work. In the Anglo-Saxon countries, it's more common. In the Netherlands, it's more common. In Scandinavia, it's more common. In most of the traditional Roman law countries, such as France and Italy and Spain, it is less common because it is actually a court of auditors. Our body, our National Audit Office, is not a court. It's an independent agency. The head, the boss, is an officer of Parliament, an officer of our House of Commons. He's not a member of the government, he's not a civil servant, he's independent and he reports to Parliament, but it is not a court. In France and in Germany and Spain, it's actually a court. They prosecute cases. They have a much more legalistic and juridical approach, and that makes concentrating on value for money questions much more difficult. And they are, I think, trying to work towards doing more value for money work because taxpayers expect it. The way we work is the National Audit Office produces a report. For example, I've got one here. This is called police procurement, and it's about the way we have in England and Wales, administratively for various reasons. England and Wales are almost always together. Scotland and Northern Ireland are separate. But anyway, there are 43 police forces in England and Wales. They're autonomous, they're separate, they have their own chief constable in each case. And this is looking at how they do the business of procurement, government procurement, how they buy uniforms for the police, how they buy police cars, how they buy boots, how they buy computers. And it's basically saying they don't do a very good job because they don't talk to each other enough. There are many, many savings they could make if they collaborated better. So we take evidence on this report with the top official from the government department concerned, not the minister, but the top permanent civil servant official, who's called the permanent secretary. He's also known as the accounting officer because he has legal responsibility to account to Parliament for how money is spent. And we have a session of several hours in the afternoon based on this report and other evidence that we may have. And then we as a committee publish our own report with the same title, where we make recommendations, and those recommendations then usually get attention in the media, in the newspapers and on radio and TV, and then the government responds to our recommendations and often accepts them and implements them, and sometimes not. But that is the basis of what we do. That's the basis of how we work, and we do that week in, week out for every part of government and for every part of government expenditure. So one week we might be looking at the office that issues passports, and how it does its job and whether it does its job well. The next week we might be looking at the bureau that keeps criminal records so that background checks can be done. For example, if you want to be a teacher and work in a school in a position where you have control of young people, they want to do extra background checks to make sure you don't have a criminal record. There's an agency, a bureau, that does those checks and keeps the records centrally to make it more easy to do background checks. We did a study on the agency that requires parents to pay for the costs of their children. When parents have a divorce, sometimes there are big arguments about money, and sometimes the state, the taxpayer, ends up picking up the bill, and we have an agency to make sure, at least theoretically, to make sure that the parent without care makes a financial contribution. We had a study that we looked at the student loan system for making loans to students who want to study at university. We look at health systems, we look at school systems, and we always look at very specific aspects of the health system. So we would look at hip replacements, or we would look at the rates of hospital infection, or we would look at the teaching of primary school mathematics. It's always very, very specific, very narrow and very focused, and we make very narrow and focused recommendations. And the thing which has impressed me most over the 13 years I've been on the committee, and I should say, when I was elected to Parliament in 2001, I was an opposition MP. So for the first 9 years in Parliament, I was an opposition MP. Since 2010, since the last general election, my party, the Conservative Party, has been in government, so I've been a government MP. So 9 years in opposition, 4 years as a government MP. But actually, my job on the committee doesn't really change, because all governments manage to get things wrong in the way they procure programs. All governments manage to waste money, my constituents' money. The area that I represent in the east of England, Keith mentioned, it's a very beautiful area. It's also a very rural area, a very agricultural area. I have about 100,000 people who live in my constituency, and some of them are well off, but by no means all of them. There are plenty of people whom I represent who do not, you wouldn't call them rich by any stretch of the imagination. They have to work very hard for the money that they get. They have to work very hard to clothe their children, to pay for all the bills that they need to pay for, to heat their house, to pay for food at the supermarket, and if they're lucky, to have enough money to go on holiday. And I feel very deeply the duty I have to them to keep the feet of government to the fire, if you like, because it is government that is spending my constituents' taxes, or in many cases, misspending my constituents' taxes. And that is a permanent job that goes on no matter who is in government. And the reason I read that book was because I was getting so frustrated at my inability to understand how it could be that such a large number of very bright people running government, and our government takes into the administrative class in the civil service some of the best people from some of the best universities. They're a very attractive destination for graduates out of good universities. A lot of people go into banking or into management consultancy and into industry and science, but it's still the case that many good graduates from the top universities in the UK go into the civil service, go into government. And it seems to me very strange that this can be the case, and yet decades later we find that these people don't have all the required skills to run the country. They have some of them, but by no means all of them. And our ministers are, in our system, of course, our ministers are taken from within Parliament. You can't become a minister unless you have a seat in Parliament, either in the lower house or the upper house, mostly in the lower house. We have a very weak form of the separation of powers, if you like. The executive has made itself a subset of the legislature. And so the group of people from whom you're selecting your ministers is also a very, very narrow pool. Only the people who are MPs, or in some cases members of the House of Lords, can be members of the government. So you have a recipe for, if you're not careful, because you don't have a very large selection pool, and the training that takes place of civil servants suffers from some perennial problems that repeat themselves. Very high staff turnover inside jobs. People move around a great deal. There's not very much emphasis on financial management. There's very little emphasis on good project management. One of the exceptions we saw to that was the London Olympics 2 years ago, which was a great success. It was delivered on budget and on time. In fact, the head of the government agency that looks at projects and helps assess whether they have gone well or badly described the London Olympics as an intellectual goldmine in terms of the learning that is available from how to do projects well. But there are still many things that go wrong. We still can't get coherence at the centre of our government between the centre and the departments to decide what it is that should be done by the centre of government and what should be done by individual departments. There are always battles going on. Some of these questions have been going on for decades, but it does make it much more difficult to secure value for money and to ensure that the projects which my constituents and other taxpayers are paying for are properly and wisely delivered. I won't say much more about my book, except to say it wasn't until I'd finished writing it that I realized, actually, that I'd written a book about organizational behavior, because fundamentally, when things go wrong in government, it's usually for the same reason as things go wrong inside any other organization, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. It's really about how people behave. And we heard from Mr. Yassin this morning about the importance of what he called the humanitarian side, in effect, the way in which human behavior influences economics. And in the study of economics in the last 25 years, we've seen something of a revolution, because the various different versions of economics that have existed for the last 100, 150 years have become, 25 years ago, I suppose by the late 80s, early 90s, various versions, whether it was classical economics, Keynesian economics, Marxist economics, were failing to explain. There were big gaps in what they were explaining, and it became increasingly apparent that the reason that they were missing things was they were too attached to mathematics, too attached to mathematical models, and not sufficiently attached to the real world and how real people in the real world actually behave, as opposed to how they are supposed to behave. And indeed, to economists, actually they were psychologists, not economists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, when they won the Nobel Prize for Economics, it was because of the work that they had done on behavior, on human behavior, and the effects of human behavior in economics. And the simple contention of my book is, the conclusion of my book is this: if it's true in economics, then it's also true elsewhere. If it's true in economics, it's also true in government. And we have actually learnt this in government, in the sense that we in the British government now are trying to use the insights of behavioral economics to get citizens to behave differently and to behave better. For example, years ago, when the tax authorities wanted people to pay their taxes on time, and they didn't pay on time, they'd send them a rude letter. They'd say, "Pay your tax or we will see you in court." It was a threat, basically. And using the insights of behavioral economics, they suddenly realized that perhaps if they instead of threatening people, gave them a sort of societal nudge if they suggested forms of behavior that were more acceptable. For example, they would write a letter saying, dear Mr. and Mrs. Smith, did you know that 89% of people in your part of Devon or your part of Norfolk have already paid their income tax? They suddenly got millions and millions of pounds in, like this, with very little effort, just for the cost of the postage stamp, because they started making people feel guilty and feeling their social responsibilities more. It had an extraordinary effect. And so we have learned already that actually the searchlight, the torch, the light that is shone by looking at things through the prism of human behavior is very powerful, and it can help persuade citizens to act in different ways. The conclusion of my book is, if this powerful torch works when you shine it on citizens, it would also work if you shone it on ministers and civil servants and government departments and the way they behave with each other. In other words, you should start doing to yourself what you're trying to do to others, and that way you might start to get better results. Of course, that does require being able to criticize those above you. It's absolutely fundamental if you're to do this, and that's why it doesn't happen very much in any government as much as it should. And it doesn't happen as much as it should in many companies, and many companies are less successful than they should because of this. Although it's an interesting fact that some of the world's most successful companies, I'm reading the biography of Steve Jobs at the moment, this wonderful book by Walter Isaacson. I don't know if it's been translated into Russian, but it's a fantastic read. It's like a thriller. Steve Jobs was a visionary in many ways and a tyrant in some ways, but a very clear visionary. But he operated in a competitive environment where people who disagreed with him could walk away. In many companies, people who disagree don't have the option of walking away, and in many countries and in many constitutional arrangements, people don't have the option of criticizing those who are above them. And I have to say, although I suppose as a member of the Conservative Party in my country, I have a set of political principles to which I broadly adhere, and I have some principles to which I am less attached. I try to keep my own personal store of theory at a minimum, because it's quite heavy baggage. It doesn't often help when you confront reality. It's sometimes better to deal with reality without too much ideological baggage. But the one piece of ideology, I suppose, that I carry on around with me all the time, it stems from, I mentioned I was at the London School of Economics. There was a professor called Karl Popper, whom some of you may have come across, who was Austrian by birth, although he was a refugee from the Second World War. He was Jewish. And he taught at the London School of Economics for many years. And there was an education minister in the 1960s called Edward Boyle. He was a conservative education minister, but of a very liberal disposition. He was quasi-academic. And he wrote a wonderful essay about Karl Popper, in which he said, it was Karl Popper who first made me realize that of all human rights, and he put human rights in inverted commas, but he said, it was Karl Popper who first made me realize that of all human rights, the most important is the right to criticize one's rulers. It is from that everything else stems. I firmly believe that, and I think that so long as we hold on to that, as long as we hold on to the belief that there are no perfect answers, there are no experts who have all the answers, and the ability to criticize and to meet and to discuss and to have your opinion changed by listening to other people, as long as we keep that flame alight, then insofar as, even if we do go wrong, we have an opportunity to put things right and to go back on the correct path. And if that path turns out to be the wrong path, as long as we retain the ability to criticize, then we have the opportunity to correct that path as well. I suppose that's one of my deepest political beliefs. The second belief that I hold to very, very dearly, very deeply indeed, is this. I don't believe you can leave it to somebody else. The reason I'm in politics, the reason I took the trouble to get elected to Parliament, is because I don't think I can sit there and blame other people for things not being the way I would like them to be. If I don't like them that way, I should try and do something about it. I don't believe there's any they who are going to sort it out for us. We have to do it. We have to do it ourselves. A few days ago, I was walking along in the corridor in the House of Commons, and I bumped into one of our Foreign Office ministers, not the Foreign Secretary, one of the junior Foreign Office ministers. I wanted to know which junior minister had responsibility for Russia. I said, I'm going to Russia soon. He said, oh, he said, we're scaling down our Russia thing. I said, yes, that's why I'm going, because it seems to me that we shouldn't be scaling down at all. We should be scaling up. The opportunity, the necessity, the duty to work harder at talking to each other and to sorting out our common problems by talking to each other becomes all the more important in times like this. Spasibo. Happy to answer questions on anything.
Итак, коллеги, пожалуйста, мы можем начинать дискуссию.
So we are ready to start the discussion. I guess this hand belongs to Maria. Maria Stomina, alumni of 2012, Sverdlovsk. I would like to elucidate what kind of information would be brought to the society through the mass media about spending the state budget. Is it a subject of journalist investigations? And is there a demand from society for this information? Thank you.
There is a demand because partly for two reasons. Newspapers, unfortunately, I suspect newspapers the world over, prefer bad news to good news. And there's a constant appetite among the media for bad news. And the government misspending money, the government spending money badly, is a permanent goldmine of bad news. And so there is a demand from the newspapers for it, but there's also a demand from the public because it's their taxes and they want to see it better spent. If they have paid tax into the centre so that there will be a proper system to make sure that we have an agency that can actually collect information about people with a criminal record, they would like it to function efficiently. Some years ago, I went to work in Tanzania for a body called VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas, and I was working for an agricultural body in Tanzania. And because of the body I was working for, VSO, I had to do one of these Criminal Records Bureau checks. And I went through the check, and it came out clean, it was all fine. The only problem was, I had already been in Tanzania and come back and been back for over a month before my clearance came through. So the whole thing was completely nugatory. It was utterly pointless. It was the triumph of form over substance. And taxpayers are entitled to expect that they get good service from their government. So it is of interest to taxpayers as well as of interest to the media.
Так, пожалуйста. Давайте с другой стороны.
So let's start on the other end. So thank you, Mr. Bacon, for your story, for your presentation. As far as I understand, the function of parliaments in the UK and Russia are slightly different because our parliament people only have legislative and representative power, but control functions are rather symbolic from year on year, more and more symbolic. And we have this Institute of Parliamentary Inquiry. Once a year, deputies listen to the annual report of the government. Just listen, but they do not approve and participate indirectly in the control, submitting the candidates to the control chamber. So my question, as far as I understand this very well pronounced control function of British Parliament or Parliament, do they prevent the coherence, the principle of political independence? If they, for instance, a chairman of a committee considered the spendings of state budget, and he's from the same party that the chairman of the government, so it's kind of biased. They're in the same boat. What do you say? Please remember to intro. Yeah, 96 alumni.
Said several things which I didn't. Number one, our committee is not a budget committee. We do not consider the state budget. We do not consider the government's version of the state budget and then chop it up and change it. That is not our job. If you look at the United States Congress, the United States Congress completely rewrites the American budget that the American government proposes, so it comes out in a completely different shape. I mean, it's very attractive. If I were in that position, I would make sure more money went to my constituency. I would get that road finished that they've been looking at for 45 years, and so on and so forth. But we do not do that. The second thing is, the chairman of our committee is a member of the opposition. That's absolutely cast in stone. It's something that nobody questions, that nobody objects to. It is just part of the fabric that the chairman of our committee is a member of the opposition. Some of the other committees, for example, in the present parliament, we have committees for transport, defence, health, all the things you would expect. And some of them they're sort of shared out. The majority are with the government party, some of them are with the opposition party. And there's a sort of agreement worked out who gets what. So most of the really good ones go to the government, but some of the really good ones go to the opposition, and then the minor ones are distributed as well. But our committee is always the opposition. And the reason for that is, actually, it's related to, I mentioned earlier, I mean, you put it very well when you said most legislatures have this, most parliaments have this legislative function and the representative function. I think, as a member of parliament, I obviously take part in legislation and I vote on it, but my personal view is we have far too many laws already, and I do as little as I can to add to the pile of more laws. I regard the control function, this scrutiny function, as part of my representative function, in a way. I'm representing the people back home who are taxpayers. And the reason it works, and I think we may be slightly, the UK in this respect, may be a slight outlier. We went to visit the Bundesrechnungshof in Germany, and they have a report once a year. And some newspapers turn up. It's a one-hit media event for one day, then they go away again for another year. We were absolutely astonished. And when we told them what we do 2 of these a week. We sit 50 or 60 times a year, and they were astonished at the way we do it. And the only reason we can do this is because of the National Audit Office. Our Supreme Audit Institution and our committee are like this. We're very, very close. We talk all the time, we're meeting all the time. And when I go around the world, it's perfectly obvious to me that it is not normal, or as normal, for the Parliamentary Committee and the Supreme Audit Institution to be very, very close. But if they are very close, it can be very powerful. The other thing is to make sure, as well as making sure that the chairman of our committee is a member of the opposition, you have to make sure the Supreme Audit Institution is independent. I mean, in Spain, the Tribunal de Cuentas has a committee in Parliament, very similar to ours, but the chairman of the committee is a member of the governing party. They put out reports saying the government is marvellous. I mean, it doesn't do any good at all. You know, it's just sugar candy. It's of no help to anybody. In our system, not only is the chairman of our committee a member of the opposition, but the head of the Supreme Audit Institution, the National Audit Office, is appointed by a motion of Parliament which has to be agreed to by the Prime Minister and by the chairman of our committee. So you've got the Prime Minister, who's obviously of the governing party, and you've got the chairman of our committee, who's obviously of the opposition party, and only when a motion with both their names on it goes forward with a name that they both agree on, can it be agreed, and then she or he is appointed as the controller and auditor general, the boss of the National Audit Office, by the Queen. So there's quite a lot of independence built in, and then there's a separate commission in Parliament so that the Supreme Audit Institution does not get its money from government, it gets its money from Parliament. And that's a further level of separation, because the temptation for any government minister to come along and criticise what the Supreme Audit Institution is doing and to criticise what our committee is doing is very real. So we have to try and make sure we build in this independence. The other thing we do is which is also equally important, the National Audit Office is statutorily prohibited from looking at policy, at questioning the merits of policy. So we don't ask whether, we ask how, and it's an extremely important difference. So, for example, if the government has a pot of money, the state budget decides, well, we could put money into adult education, or we could put money into education for kindergarten, for nursery, for 3 to 5s. We do not question that decision. That's policy. We leave that to the government, or to other political parties, or to other parliamentary committees. The Education Committee might have a view on that. We don't. We say, that's your policy. You've decided you're going to spend it on education for 3 to 5-year-olds. We simply ask, how well did you spend the money that you devoted to that, your policy? Did you do it well, or did you do it badly?
As an outsider, in that I was never on this committee, but I was in Parliament for 23 years, I would stress 2 points that Richard's made. At the moment, the chairman of his committee is a most formidable woman, Mrs. Hodge, who is a member of the Labour Party, the opposition. And I tell you, she is never off the media on these reports. I mean, she's just phenomenal at getting a message across. And there are many people, many commentators would say that she is a more powerful figure, more influential than more than half the ministers of the government. She has huge impact on government, largely because, as Richard said, it shines a light on what is happening. In other words, it throws information out to the public, to anybody, to journalists, to her. For example, if a government, it's a very popular thing in a recession to say you're going to create job creation, a scheme to create jobs for 18-year-olds. Okay, fine, great concept. But the government of the day that creates that policy is not going to tell the public or anybody that the cost of each of those jobs is something like £100,000 a person that gets a job, because the scheme is incompetently run. And that is what this committee does. It has independent teams who work out how much is the cost of this scheme. And it's an outrage, and the whole country knows it. And you should be doing this, in my view, even in England, at every level, at the regional level, at the local city level, because they will all cover up. Nobody, the voters will not know, unless there's an independent body, what actually is incompetently being done by the people they elect.
Продолжаем. Пожалуйста, Екатерина.
Спасибо за такой эмоциональный.
Oh, thank you for this emotional story, Katerina. Alumni 2013, with my colleague listening to your presentation, we tried to imagine such a structure in our regional parliament where out of 45 members, 43 from the main party and 2 from the opposition. This is a wonderful structure. So far, we cannot even imagine how to change it, 43 against 2. So in your story, we heard so many times the word responsibility to the voters, to the parliament members. It's not a question, probably a comment that I want to say. When I saw in America, in a number of European countries, this responsibility, this understanding of power that gives you an imprint on all your activity, because our system is such that a person who understands his responsibility and ready to make unpopular decisions, painful but very necessary decisions, or do something the right way, will be just digested or swallowed and spat out by the system. So, but you have just the opposite. Most of the deputies have this level of responsibility, and you will pack, together someone who will make bad decisions. So I hope this is my comment. I hope I'm right. Thank you very much.
Right, but it's not always like that. I mean, Keith mentioned when we had a piece of legislation to restrict the freedom of the press, it was basically to to make it much easier for people to sue the press if they wrote things that you didn't like, and to provide for what were called exemplary punitive damages, financially to make it extremely difficult for people. So it was, in effect, a quite important restriction on press freedom. And I regret to say that most of my colleagues in the Houses of Parliament, most of my colleagues of all parties were quite happy to support it. They voted for it. There were 500 MPs who voted for it. There were only 15 who voted against. But the reason I voted against was because my view, I don't often vote against my own government. In fact, that was the first time I'd voted against my own government at all. But my view is the ability to criticize the government is the most important thing. It's more important than anything else. It's far more important than the substance of a particular policy, because policy can always change. But the ability to criticize must be a constant if you're to have the possibility of improvement. And I'm a government MP now. I was an opposition MP for 9 years, but I'm a government MP for 4 years. And I would say, I don't know your region, but those 43 MPs, they may be in the majority, but they also have a responsibility to the people who sent them to that assembly to look after their interests and to safeguard their interests and to make sure that the taxes are well spent. The responsibility sits on every elected representative of whatever party, I would say.
Катя, я подумал, может, у вас много комитетов?
I understand that you have too many committees. If you had 2, you would have opposition in each of them. But probably you have 20 of them. That's why you don't have enough people to fill them in.
Чекушкин
Sergei Chuvashet, 2014. Thank you, Richard. I have 2 questions. You said that in your committee you have 800 people, and 600 count 2 by 2 is 4, and 200 calculate the efficiency ratio. Then, so how do you actually calculate and determine this efficiency ratio? How the 3 indicators that show the usefulness of those spendings? And what happens once those 200 people say that last year we spent that much, but it was inefficient, this money was wasted? So what happens?
I should be clear. Our committee has 14 members of parliament, 14, of which 8 are government and 6 are opposition. And of the of the 6, one of them is the chair, and she's a member of the opposition. The National Audit Office, which is separate from us, the Supreme Audit Institution, it's a separate body, that has 800 officials, and they audit all there are about 560 different government bodies of various kinds. You know, the driver vehicle licensing agency that gives you your driving license, or the body that gives you a license to bury somebody at sea, or whatever it is. There are lots of different agencies. The one that regulates fishing, you name it. And they all have accounts which are audited. The 200 of the 800 people who do the value for money work, they estimate that of essentially for every, the budget of the National Audit Office is quite small. Compared with government as a whole, it's tiny. The National Audit Office, they have some income from their activities because they have some things for which they charge fees. So their gross income is a bit higher, but their net income requirement from Parliament is £63 million a year. Well, the government spends 700 billion. It's about, I guess, about $1 trillion US, maybe a bit more, 1.2. So it is the budget of the National Audit Office is tiny, but they do reckon that for every pound that they spend, they achieve visible savings of £9 or £10, so that they definitely earn their keep.
Так, продолжаем. Прошу, сударыня, вам слово. Да-да.
Yeah, the floor is yours. Lydia Reldieva, graduate 2005. So I would rather have a comment. You were speaking about the role of psychology, both in rational and logical explanation. My brother, for the last 12 years in Buryatia Republic, heads the Committee on Economic Policy in the regional parliament, and he's a graduate of the school. And speaking about the role and history of the school, in 2002 he became the chairman of the committee. In 2003 he became a graduate, an alumni. So probably it mattered. Not for nothing. And he... It seems that over those 12 years, there's a feeling that he's ahead of his time, because this mass psychology, even at the level of a head of the region, so twice there were serious conflicts in 2005 and in 2010, when the head of the governor called him a populist for criticizing the social economic development program for the region. And in Russia, in this country, we are not accustomed to often. We even forget about the diversity of the branches of power. So the power is one, executive or legislative. So they just get into kind of collision and becomes a nonsense, absurdity. And a person who tries to speak up and perform a function of a people's representative gets a reputation of a scandalist. So I understand that we are very special, we're a big country, but probably you would have a comment about it.
Well, I won't talk about your brother because I don't know him, but I think the instinct for people who have power to hug it all to themselves is normal. You see that all over the world, and that's precisely why it's important to have autonomous institutions and a degree of institutional tension. We were listening this morning to a discussion about institutions and the importance of institutions. I'm very interested in institutional architecture, getting the architecture right that enables a government to govern, which is what a government needs to do, and at the same time allows the government to hear, in its ears, to hear criticism, but also to distinguish between the criticism which it needs to take notice of and the criticism which is the kind of criticism you'll always get because people love complaining about the government of the day. There's no country on earth where people do not like complaining about the government, apart from North Korea, I suppose. But because they know they will get shot straight away. But generally speaking, most people on the planet love the chance for a good whinge about the government. I hope you can translate whinge into Russian. And that's universal. And so we need arrangements which allow us to have sensible, constructive criticism of the government and to suggest alternatives, and at the same time which allow government to govern, and which also recognize that there is something about power which is in itself corrupting. The vice chancellor of my local university, in fact, he's still there. His name's Edward Acton. He's an historian of the Russian Revolution, actually. He's a Russian expert. His name's Edward Acton, and his great-grandfather, Lord Acton, was an historian years ago in the 19th century. He said something very famous: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And when you add to that Plato's thought, which is that those who want to exercise political power are usually those least suited to doing so. Those who want to exercise political power are usually those least suited to exercising power. For a whole variety of reasons. People often want power for the wrong reasons. And then when they get it, they want more. I think it's very important to have an institutional architecture that allows and encourages and cherishes, I think that's the right word, cherishes the ability to oppose those who govern you, so that you can oppose the government without being disloyal, that you can oppose the government without opposing the state. Because, it's very interesting, to me it's interesting. In our system, we have, those of you who've seen a photograph of the House of Commons will know that we have benches on one side and a table in the middle and benches on the other side. And the party that makes up the government is obviously the one with the most MPs. The party that makes up the official opposition, and they're called the official opposition. There's a post, a post in law with a salary paid by the government called Leader of the Opposition. And it's currently Ed Miliband. He's paid a salary, a much higher salary than normal MPs, to be the Leader of the Opposition. His job is to criticize the government. His job is to oppose, and he's paid by the government to do that. And his full title is Her Majesty's Leader of the Opposition, or even more correctly, Her Majesty's Leader of the Loyal Opposition. That's to say, they're loyal to the Crown, loyal to the state, but they oppose the government of the day. So you have this institutionalized permanent tension which allows, permits, encourages, even cherishes the ability to criticize, because it's the best way of, if you like, providing a process of continual correction. Oh, yes, thank you. And as for thinking you won't change things, and for thinking you've got insuperable odds, right at the beginning of this biography of Steve Jobs, who founded Apple, and don't forget, Apple was just his idea. It was he started it in a garage. It was extreme in the late 1970s. He was extremely successful. He was worth $250 million by the time he was 25 years old. By the time he was 30, he was sacked from Apple. Then it went downhill. Then he had to come back and he had to rescue it. It's the most extraordinary story. But one of the things he says, which is used as the front quote of the whole book, is this: the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. And I think that's true. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. And I think that's true. There's no they who are going to change the world for us. It is we, around this table and around other tables, it is we who have to change the world. If we want to change the world, it is we who have to do it.
Anna Skodaeva, your question, please. Mr. Bacon, thank you for your very interesting presentation and the story and your answers. Could you comment on the following event? Last week, in my regional parliament, in the region where I come from, in Kostroma, a member of parliament was excluded from an MP's group because he asked to vote for inviting to the parliament of senators, of the members of the Council of Federation, who would have to explain why they had given the license for the Russian president to enter Crimea. For that, he was ostracized and excluded from an MP's group. How likely is such situation in Britain? And my other question, have you ever had any propositions to make a presentation of yours or a speech of yours at the Parliament classified? That is to restrict, access to it.
No, to answer the second question, no, none of it's classified. The work we do is all in the public domain. It's about public money, which all the information is published, and it's openly available for criticism. On an MP being excluded from a group for suggesting that somebody be called as a witness, when we had the vote on Syria a few months ago, we had a party caucus beforehand, and it was very obvious that the party wanted us to vote for the government motion. The government motion basically called for the principle, the theoretical principle of supporting military action in certain circumstances. And the opposition party had a slightly different motion, but which also called for military action in theory, to back it in principle. Most of my party voted for the motion, and a significant number of the opposition party voted against. In fact, the Parliament as a whole voted down both motions. But what was quite clear to me in the party caucus that I was in a very small minority. In my party, we have 300 MPs. Only 30 of our MPs wanted to oppose the motion. But the collective will of Parliament, including us and the other MPs of the other parties, was enough to defeat both the government motion and the opposition motion. And the effect of that was that the Obama administration then said, well, if we're going to have a military attack, we need the support of our Congress as well. And then they talked to the Congress. They found out that the representatives in Congress went back and talked to their people back home in their districts. And it became quite clear that they did not want military action either. So it ended up turning the tide against military action. And I'm convinced that it was the right thing to do. But there are still people who criticize those of us who voted against it on the basis that somehow this made Crimea more likely. I mean, I find this an extraordinary stretch, frankly. I don't think it made Crimea more likely at all. I think it's very important that nations act rationally on the basis of their interests, and that you have elected governments that are, when they are got rid of in the proper way through elections rather than through what you might call a coup. And if you have people running a government who are got, however much you dislike them, if they are got rid of through processes that are not constitutional, then there will be a reaction to that. And I think that's what happened in this case.
Так, продолжаем. Джамбулат Оздоев, пожалуйста.
Jambulat Ozdoev. Thank you, Mr. Bacon. Thank you for your very interesting lecture. My question is about budgetary expenses. Several years ago, this school had a seminar in France, and we were getting familiar with the experience of participatory democracy in France, including the budget expenditures and the budget assignments, as well as the question of prioritizing or ranging the priorities for such budget expenditures. There were some cases that we considered when the local parliament took a decision and the local citizens participated in establishing this order of expenditures. This was a big surprise to me to view this and to watch this participatory democracy in action. I would be very much interested to hear your comments about how such methods could be used in Britain. And my second very small question, I know that you have initiated payment of taxes by ministers for the use of service cars. Do you not believe that this is a bit excessive as a measure?
I'll take the second one first. I was asked that question on radio. Did I not believe it was a bit excessive? And in fact, what has actually happened is that the government pays the tax for officials when they have official cars, insofar as it's a benefit in kind. And my answer was, it depends what it is for. If it's government business, they shouldn't be paying tax on it at all, because it's not a benefit, it's part of their work. But if it's private and it's a private benefit, then it should be taxable, just like if you work for a big company and they give you a car, the benefit from that is taxable. So what I say is treat people in the same way. If you have like conditions, similar conditions, treat them in the same way. But if it's for work, then it should not be taxable. On the question of France and the budget priorities and assigning priorities, of course, assigning priorities and deciding that you will spend the budget on X, Y, and Z and not spend it on P, Q, and R is at the heart of politics, making these budgetary priority decisions, the decisions to undertake some expenditure and not to undertake other expenditure, are absolutely the heart of politics. And I'm not very good at that because that's not what we do on our committee, to be honest. But I look at the situation in France where they have very visible elected mayors. So every major town and even smaller towns have their own mayor who's a very visible figure. And I often wish we had a slightly more directly accountable system locally in England. For example, as the local member of parliament, I will be asked by constituents, parents of school children who go to a school, to come and look at a traffic problem. So you've got a school, say it's in a rural, very rural area, and the main village is over here, but the school is outside the village, about a mile away. And so the road going past the school, even though it's a very small country road, has the national speed limit of 60 miles an hour, which is 100 kilometres an hour. And you and I would think, well, it's outside a school, it should be a much lower limit. And I go and see this thing with the parents, and I write lots of letters, and I ask the local administration, the local authorities to do something about it. 2 years and 9 months later, I'm back looking at the same problem, and nothing has been done. And I would like to see, using the French or the American model, much more direct accountability, where a local elected person could say to his officials, get this fixed, I want to see this done by next Tuesday, and get it done. And if you like what this person as the elected official does, then you back them, they get another term. If you don't like them, you sack them, you get rid of them. And you have much more direct accountability. Instead of which, it goes through layer after layer after layer of committee. There's an enormous cost. You might think it's just putting up a sign with a speed limit, which is not very expensive. But the cost of the process to get to that point is thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds. And I would like to cut through all that. So I think administratively in England, we've got potentially quite a lot to learn. We are a very centralised country in the UK. It's very, very centralised on London. And I would like to see more real autonomy and decentralisation given to local councils. But I think to make it politically sexy, to make it politically more exciting, I think it should be done with a very visible leader who is elected and who can be got rid of. And we've done this in London. Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, who's called Boris because I think his father, the Russian ambassador to Mexico, I think it was, did him a great favour, and in return he promised if he had a son he would call him Boris, and he did, so he's called Boris. Boris, he's the only politician in Britain whom everybody knows without using his surname. They just call him Boris. Boris is a very visible figure. He was elected as a Conservative in a big city like London that is usually left-leaning, and one of the advantages of having direct election for local administration is that it reduces the party political content to some extent, or can do. The importance of the personality of the right person becomes more important. So you have more chance, I think, for different people to come through from different political backgrounds.
Так.
Litvinova. I'm alumnus of 2007. I am from Rostov-on-Don, which is in the south of Russia, and my region has no oil, so we have to try and develop our economy elsewhere. Mr. Bacon, thank you very much thank you for your very English presentation. I think that you might be the first European for this session. No other Europeans in this hall? Oh, Madam, I think that you may not have the second chance of asking your question. Right, I'm already perplexed. All right. So, question about the relations between Russia and Europe in the context of most recent developments. How strict will the sanctions be? What will be the repercussions of these? Many Russian politicians and many citizens of Russia think that such sanctions are nothing but a mosquito bite, because the Europeans are not interested in losing the great investments that have been made into Russia. And do you believe that Europe can go a long way in trying to make their point, so to speak? Because this would depend. This would, in many ways, how far would Europe be prepared to go to defend, to stand for democracy?
I think the the original reaction and the subsequent chain of reactions to events does suggest that there's division in Europe. You only have to look at the positions taken by the different European governments, like Germany, does suggest that, I'm just telling you my personal view, I don't think that sanctions will be particularly effective, not least because many big companies, and the Financial Times a few days ago, the main newspaper for the finance sector, one of the two leading financial newspapers in the world probably, with the Wall Street Journal. The Financial Times had a front page story the other day saying that big companies, big Western companies, were lobbying government, British government and other European governments behind the scenes to dial down the temperature on sanctions because it was going to hurt. Now, it's probably the case that if the Western governments were determined enough and were prepared to pay a big enough price in terms of an economic hit, that it is possible they could have very, very successful and effective sanctions that would hurt everybody. They would hurt Russia and they would hurt the West. But we have come out of a very prolonged recession. We're still very fragile economically. There's been some recovery in the last year or so, but it is still quite fragile, largely caused by a combination of governments spending far too much money and then an enormous banking crisis caused by under-regulated banks going mad, basically, and crashing the whole world. And someone mentioned Iceland this morning. If you ever get the chance to see the film Inside Job, which won the Oscar for Best Documentary about 5 years ago, it's narrated by the film star Matt Damon, but it's not like the Bourne Supremacy. It's actually a fact. The scary thing is it's fact. But he's if you like, he's the voiceover. He's the narrator. And it's called Inside Job, and it's about the story of how the banking crash evolved over the previous years and the deregulation that happened that led banks to be allowed to go crazy. And because of the financial pain, I mean, the UK's GDP shrunk by 7% because of the banking crash. Of course, the UK is very dependent on banking, but the whole of the West has taken a very big hit. You then look at the situation in Europe, where because of the Eurozone, Mr. Yasin was talking about this morning, but it is a direct consequence of the Euro that Spain and Portugal and Greece have very high levels of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and they are by no means economically on the recovery path yet. And my own personal view is, so long as the euro is as it is, there's very little chance that they will recover. They could actually have deflation. Things could get steadily worse for many, many years if we're not careful. Against that backdrop, the idea that most Western governments are going to be willing to see further economic pain in order to punish Russia, I personally don't see it, because most of our constituents don't want that. They just want to get on with their lives. So I don't personally think there's going to be really deep, effective sanctions. I don't see that that's going to happen. Maybe there are people who think it should, but I don't think it will.
I think there is another angle, which is that there was a piece in one of the British papers which was arguing quite an interesting point, that Putin is not or should not be seen as a brilliant chess master, in that actually he's misconstrued a whole series of moves to the point at which he will end up embattled in a corner in a way which he exactly had hitherto been against. So, for example, there is already a massive flight of capital, as you heard this morning, out of Russia. It's been growing for some time, but it's absolutely colossal. The reverse is also true. There are dramatic reductions in inward investment, because companies, not the big boys, I mean, who call, the president, I'm sure, calls in Shell and Exxon and the rest and says, I want to know what your forward plans are. And of course, they're so committed, they have to fall in line there. But the majority of smaller investors, I did work for some years here with smaller investors. They've always been scared a bit of the Russian system, the lack of independent judiciary, the bugbears at frontiers, having to pay backhanders, the seizure of goods until you pay up, a whole series of things have caused problems. And will we get our money out was always a question. And these people are now being put off, very seriously put off, because they do expect things to get tougher. The ruble has gone down from, 3 weeks ago I got 43, I think, to the pound. It's now 57.5 to the pound. Probably a little managed by the Russian authorities, eased it a bit, but how much money is there left in Mr. Kudrin's? I wish he'd been here, actually. He's ill, but how much money in the Stability Fund is there left? As it goes down, inflation spirals up. That costs you a lot more as a government on debt. If there is any pressure on the oil price below 110, there are serious repercussions on the deficit and the debt you're having to pay at higher costs. All of these things, I am sure President Putin's government had never intended, and are the unforeseen consequences, which will, in my view, tighten and get worse. And it does depend, of course, on individuals as well as major companies. And I was speaking to a senior German figure who used to be involved with a previous CDU government, and he assured me that although it's a difficult economic situation for the Germans, in that nearly a third of their energy sources are dependent on Russian, and that is a further point which I think wasn't taken into account. There is absolutely no question whatsoever that all Western countries now will seek, as a matter of rapid course of action, will seek energy independence from Russia, and that will have a dramatic effect on Gazprom and the energy industry here. And so he did assure me that whatever the economic problems, Mrs. Merkel was a young person in East Germany at the same time, basically, as President Putin was acting in Dresden. And she is personally, the whole regime and what it stood for, and the censorship and the lack of opportunity is so an anathema to her that she is personally of a very strong will over all of this matter.
I think all of what you've said is true. It's also true that most of those things are happening not because of sanctions by Western governments. They're just happening anyway. And they probably were unexpected. But things like the capital flight, things like the fall in the value of the ruble, the amount of investment that will be attracted to come to Russia in the future, things like the oil price, all of which are extremely important for Russia, and indeed that they're important in all jurisdictions. If you want to attract foreign investment, you have to have a climate that's friendly towards it. If you want to have a stable currency, the governments have to act in certain ways because currency markets are free. Lots of these things are happening anyway, not because of sanctions by Western governments. And I think they will continue to happen, and I think it will continue to be damaging to Russia unless Russia changes course. But I still don't think that's not mainly happening because of Western governments. It's happening because of the reaction of the capital flight is happening because of the reaction of Russians to their own government. The reaction of investors is happening because investors don't want to invest in this sort of climate where there's this degree of uncertainty. And it could all be very different. It could all be very different. I mean, I personally do not draw a distinction in my own mind. I'm a great believer in free trade. I'm not an enormous fan of the European Union by any stretch of the imagination, because one of the things it does is it puts up trade barriers, and lots of countries in the world that would like to trade with us and who would be richer if they did trade with us, including some of the many poor countries in Africa, the one thing that they can't do with us, which would help them become more prosperous, is sell us the goods that they're good at making. There's no reason why we couldn't have free trade, not simply from, as it were, Vladivostok to Lisbon. There's no reason why you couldn't have free trade from Vladivostok to San Francisco, and I mean the long way, with everybody. There's no reason why you couldn't have that. You just have to believe it's possible. If you think that is possible. Let me get the quote right again. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. There's no reason why you couldn't have free trade everywhere. There's no need. What happens with governments is they get in the way. They get in the way of people. They get in the way of people who naturally would interact with each other, who naturally trade with each other, who with the right environment would feel safe to invest with each other, and we would all be living in a more prosperous and more peaceful world.
Так, прошу, коллега, господин депутат, по-моему, да? Прошу вас.
Thank you. Maxim Postnikov from Kostroma, alumnus of 2012. Mr. Bacon, the beginning of this session, it was said that the real world is very much different from the mathematical systems that some people might offer to explain it. And often it is important to apply behavioral patterns. And in some one could have a letter from the Internal Revenue Service that 97% of people have already paid their taxes. How about you? In that sense, this behavioral economics, does it have any positive influence? Are there any examples that you could quote? Talking of the mistakes of governments, if these mistakes are deliberate, do you believe that there are cases when people, apparently in the question must be about Britain, but could you quote cases when people were prosecuted for financial machinations?
Well, on the first point on behavioral economics, I was really making a comment about the big shift which we have seen in the whole discipline of economics in the last 25 years, in order that it should take more account of behavior. And the reason why it's become mainstream is because it offers a better and richer explanation of the real world economy than many of the theoretical models were doing by themselves. The tax example that I gave, the tax letters, is just one example. The British government set up a thing called the Behavioural Insights Unit in number 10, the purpose of which was to try and look for different areas of life where government interacts with citizens to try and improve their behaviour. The most obvious examples are in areas such as health and education, where they've done experiments to try and use similar techniques to try and get improved behaviour. In terms of mistakes of government, in most cases, I don't think the mistakes are deliberate. It's a combination of forces that result in a very suboptimal outcome in many cases. Where there is deliberate fraud, financial fraud, you do occasionally get prosecutions, but frankly, we believe on our committee that there should be, where there is deliberate evidence of malpractice, there should be, the revenue, for example, the tax authorities should be more keen to prosecute than they are, where people have evaded their taxes, and very often they have a quite poor record of prosecution. We think they should do a little bit more of that.
Так, еще чуть-чуть. Роман, пожалуйста.
Just one question. Roman Pluta from Krasnoyarsk, alumnus of 2007. The United Kingdom is one of the few countries which has remained loyal to the to the idea of a monarchy. And without going deep into the question, is there any does your committee deal with overseeing the financial spending of the royal family? So we know about the civil servants and the control that you exercise over that, but do you exercise any control? This is especially important for the Russians. Mr. Zakharov intervened.
Yes, we do look at the finances of the royal family. More than probably we should, given in terms of their size, and compared with the Defence Ministry or the National Health Service or education, the royal family finances are tiny. But occasionally we do look at them, and we have the right to look at them because the accounts are laid before Parliament. And it always arouses a lot of interest from the newspapers. 2 years ago, because we had the Olympics and we had the Diamond Jubilee, because the Queen has been, Her Majesty the Queen has been on the throne for 60 years, the monarchy spent more money than it would usually spend. And we did what I thought was quite a good report, in which we talked about the work that the Prince of Wales is doing with development of better housing. He's got a project down in the West Country where he's developed over 1,000 dwellings on an estate, and using much higher architectural standards and much more sustainable. There's a lot that's good that's going on. So we referred to this in our report. The only bit the newspapers were interested in was that the Queen's reserves had fallen, and the headline was that she was down to her last £1 million. And so, yes, we do. But the funny thing is, actually, on a serious point, for a moment, I mean, it's an interesting fact. I mean, I've only really recently realized this, but if you look at the countries that have the highest score in the United Nations Human Development Index, we think typically of Scandinavia as a very well-governed space. The Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they're all monarchies. It's quite strange. But the way we think about it in the UK, I think not everybody is a monarchist. I mean, I'm a strong monarchist, but there are some who are not. But certainly there are more monarchists than there are who would support anything else. What is Walter Bagehot, the English constitutional historian, put the distinction very clearly. He described what he called the dignified and the efficient parts of the Constitution as quite separate entities. And if you have them fused in one person, as they do in France, or in the United States or in some other countries, naturally enough, the dignified part of the Constitution and the efficient part, the political part, they get mixed up. They have to get mixed up. We kind of keep those very separate. So the Queen doesn't get involved in politics at all. And she can't. She cannot get involved in politics. She's completely separate from it and serves as a sort of unity for the country, and governments are elected, and she appoints the government, but only after an election. She doesn't really have much say in who she appoints. She appoints the leader of the party that has won the election. And there's a fine balance, but it's worked quite well for 1,000 years, and I think we plan to keep it.
Коллеги, время истекло, к сожалению.
Colleagues, our time is up, and I would like to say that Mr. Bacon has had a great debut here in Golitsino, and we're so thankful to him for sharing his time with us. Of course, we are all very keen on talking with you. Thank you so very much. We shall resume in 30 minutes.
Thanks. I was going to suggest giving a copy of your book to Lena, but I noticed that one's your working
I
copy.
I will get her one, but unfortunately, this one's all scrawled over. Yeah.
I've definitely going to read
Yeah,
it. It's
yeah.
got some good nuggets in it. I'm very impressed by it.
I will certainly get her a
Who's this
clean one.
company that's done it? I mean,
Bite Bag. They are now, after they've been going for 10 years or so. Do you remember Ian Dale's shop, Politicos, in Artillery Road?
absolutely, yeah.
Well, Politicos.
Then